Our final speaker this afternoon is Professor Carter Findley, an expert on Turkey and the modern Middle East, who comes to us from the History Department at Ohio State University. And unlike our other two panelists who come out of Stanford, he received his education at Yale and Harvard. So no California sunshine for you. As you may have noticed from the front page of today's Washington Post, the Turkish Prime Minister is here in Washington today, so it's especially fortunate that we have the chance to hear from a distinguished and widely published scholar whose newest book, written under a fellowship from the NEH, is entitled Turkey, Islam, Nationalism, and Modernity. Without knowing precisely what he intends to talk about, I expect that he will offer a living, breathing example of a humanities academic whose work as a historian, a linguist, and a scholar is very important in informing many of our communities about what really matters in the evolving relationships between the U.S. and Turkey, as well as the role that Turkey plays as a very important country dealing with many of the wider issues in the Middle East. So with that.
You will find me less eloquent than the preceding speakers. I will also focus more narrowly on the issue of language learning, which for me has been the sine qua non for everything I have done. I am a historian, not a linguist or a scholar of literature, but I could not have studied history of places outside the United States without real engagement in language. My desire for this came early. From the age of 5, I wanted to learn languages the way the other boys wanted to play ball. They got to play ball. I did not get to learn the languages, at least not anytime soon. As an adolescent, when I learned that the Jewish kids got to go to Hebrew school in the afternoon after school, while I was just supposed to go outside and play, I got jealous. I wanted to go to Hebrew school too. Even in one of the best public high schools of the city, Latin and Spanish were limited to 2 years each. At least it was enough Latin to convince me that I really did want to learn languages, to organize my mind, and to clarify my understanding of English. Real language learning only became possible for me as a scholarship student at Yale. There I had 3 years of French meticulously taught. I was going to take 4 years, but I realized I had better squeeze in some German to get ready for graduate school. I knew by then that I wanted to get a PhD in a field that combined language, literature, and history. I also had the idea that I wanted to get into a new field of history that was not already overworked. I began looking around and finally decided to apply to graduate programs in Middle Eastern history. And the rest is, well, the biography of a history professor who specializes in Ottoman history and Turkish studies. What sort of morals emerge from a tale like that? Language learning is like baseball in the sense that some people are good at it and some are not. Language learning and professions that depend on it are unlike baseball in that language learners do not have national teams, big stadiums, sponsorship from beer companies, huge fan bases, or media exposure. If the comparison sounds silly, its consequences are not. Policy about language learning and professions that depend on it ends up being made in large part by people who may not have any more aptitude for language learning than I do for baseball. However likely that is to be the case in Washington, it is no less true on university campuses. A very large percentage of university faculty members work in fields that do not directly require language knowledge. Many of these people become deans and provosts, and they make budget-driven decisions that are very unfriendly to language teaching functions of their language departments. The curricula of the departments become padded with courses that do not require knowledge of the language. Actual language instruction tends to be left to instructors whose qualifications do not go beyond being native speakers of the language. And soon faculty hires begin to be deflected to just about anything but language and literature. Once whole departments get caught up in this kind of trend, and especially after they have a chair who represents this idea of what a department is good for, the results can be very hard to turn around. In some of the less commonly taught languages, these problems are magnified by the fact that the investment needed to create top quality instructional materials has actually never really been made, not even yet. Now, there are creative solutions to problems like this, and I could give you examples of them. I have finally met up with some people at my campus who have ideas about this, but in the interest of time, I think it might be better to leave that for the Q&A. And then let me talk now about another problem that also affects our university, and it grows out of the fact that many of us actually don't, whatever interests we have in other cultures, we actually don't engage in the language learning. One of the biggest problems at Ohio State as it relates to the Middle East, and I dare say other parts of the world too, is what alas we might call the securitization of U.S. thinking about these things. To give you an example of what I mean, after the Arab Spring, a evening panel was convened in the law school where faculty members were brought in to talk about it. And one of the people they asked to talk was me. So I quickly swatted up and, got ready to go in with some thoughts about what was going on in Egypt and Tunis and other relevant countries. Most of the people who spoke on the panel, and 90% of the questions afterwards, were not about that at all. They were about U.S. policy towards this region and about this region as a piece of the U.S. policy picture. In other words, it's a kind of narcissistic thing where when we think we're thinking about the Middle East, we're really looking in the mirror and seeing ourselves thinking about the Middle East, but not really engaging with the Middle East. This is obviously the security, the foreign policy and military policy these are important topics, but they drive things to an excessive degree. At my university, there are some obvious reasons for this. We have, for better or for worse, one of the oldest and best military history programs in the country. One of the oldest and best endowed institutions on the campus is something called the Mershon Center for it used to be National Security Studies. After about 1992, they changed it to International Security Studies and got a sufficiently more flexible view of the world that they even gave me some funding for my research. God bless them. But this is a major reason for this problem that I'm talking about. All right, so we've got this problem about budget-driven decisions made by people who really don't have a first-hand engagement in language learning, and then this overweening securitization of thinking about other parts of the world. Much of the government investment that has gone into promoting language and area studies since 1945 was predicated on the premise that this investment was needed for national security and not in any narrow sense. Much of my graduate education was paid for by what were known then as NDFL fellowships. Today they are known as FLAS fellowships. As a graduate student, I had to take courses in Turkish and Arabic at the same time that I prepared for my PhD qualifying exams covering multiple fields of history. Today my students have to do the same thing. If I had not had fellowships, I would have had to divide my time between my studies and working as a TA. And I would not have been able to complete both my language studies and my other degree requirements in time. The same is true for my students today. So this is a really concrete illustration of the importance of things like the FLAS fellowship funding. It really makes a vital difference, and in terms of the U.S. preparation to deal with the rest of the world, it's really basic. Parenthetically, let me note that former Senator David Boren was a college classmate of mine, and I was glad to see the creation of the Boren Fellowships as a tribute to his senatorial legacy. Acquiring usable levels of language proficiency is both labor-intensive and cost-intensive, and it is a long-term commitment. We're not talking about the year or two of lower-level classes that it takes to fulfill an undergraduate language requirement. I'm talking about the amount of study that it takes my students to prepare to do fieldwork or archival research in Istanbul or Cairo. For those who go into public service, it is the extended intensive study required actually to do their jobs in an acquired language in the way that Eli was talking about. There are no shortcuts, no 3-week mini courses that can do this, and the culture courses that don't require learning the language, they can't do it either. How have my early motivation and the investment made in my language studies paid off? Well, that's for others to say, I suppose, but I can tell you some of the things that they have enabled me to do in the past year or so. They have enabled me to appear as a guest host on a 3-hour live talk show about history on Turkish television one Saturday night in September, to do extended press interviews in Turkish and then answer follow-up questions from the journalists in writing, to negotiate in Turkish with my publisher in Istanbul and with potential donors to our university, and also to edit translations that required a high level of accuracy. Let me add that I do not write for publication in my acquired languages without having somebody else also go over my work before it goes into print. Just a prudent precaution. The television show is still online, and the full-page press article is about to appear in a week or so. For a 5-year-old who wanted to learn languages, to do so took time, work, and investment. Here is a reality check about the importance of the humanities in general and of language study in specific. Language study is a serious business. It is costly and labor intensive. It cannot be done up to the level needed to serve national interests unless this seriousness is recognized both in Washington and on university campuses. Thank you.
You can applaud now for all the speakers.